In Chapter 5, we turn to the concept of joint ownership. So, what happens is, if I could just explain it first before you read the problem, the way this works is that in the examples that we've given so far, every owner owned 100% of their minerals. But what happens very commonly is that more than one person will own in the same piece of property. Let's say this is 160 acres. So you have, instead of there being, for example, you have four owners. Owner A owns in the northwest quarter, owner B owns in the northeast quarter, owner C owns in the southeast quarter, and D owns in the southwest quarter. That's called divided interest. But if you have an undivided interest, it's literally not divided. So rather than saying A owns in this quarter and B owns in this quarter and C owns in this quarter and D owns in this quarter, we say they all own 25% in each, literally in every molecule in this piece of property. So they each own a 25% undivided interest. And it's called undivided because it cannot be divided unless it's by like judicial partition, where a judge can divide it out. But the key concept to recognize is that there's no specific area where A owns only, B owns only. Each owns a 25% undivided royalty interest. So in that case, when you have their royalty interest, now you're going to have to reduce that royalty interest, because usually what we've been talking about before, it's been times 100%. We haven't had to say that because we're just talking about the royalty interest, but now we're going to reduce this royalty interest by their actual undivided interest. So in this case, it would be their royalty interest times 25%, or a 0.25. So that's what we're going to do in this problem. And this is called undivided ownership or joint tenancy. And A, B, C, and D are referred to as co-tenants or tenants in common. And that's abbreviated tenants in common. So we're going to start doing more and more of the acronyms for these things instead of the actual words. So I'm no longer saying royalty, I'm saying royalty interest. And for this particular, whatever their percentage interest is called, that's called their mineral interest. Sometimes it's called a mineral ownership interest, but I'm going to call this a mineral interest, and that's going to be abbreviated as MI. So the way the formula works, it's the royalty interest times the mineral interest, and that's what's going to equal the net revenue interest. All you have to remember is that we have to reduce that royalty by their actual percentage of interest. Okay, so now let's look at the problem itself. And it says Mike Brady owns 160 acres in the northwest quarter of Section 6. Upon his death, his property passes to his four children, Greg, Peter, Bobby, and Cindy, who each own a 25% undivided interest in the 160 acres. Marshall Drilling takes separate leases from the heirs with a 1/8 royalty in their respective leases. So they're all taking separate leases, but what they negotiate in each of their leases is a 1/8 royalty. So we'll do it this way in problem 5. We'll do it all where they have the same royalty interest, and then when we get to 6, we'll switch it where they have different royalty interests. So let's look now at what is the net revenue of each. Well, if we look at Greg, okay, Greg has a 1/8 royalty or 0.125 royalty interest. And in fact, they all have that 0.125 interest. I'm just going to put it in each of these. So they all negotiated a 1/8 royalty, which is a 0.125 interest. Now we're going to multiply their royalty times what their mineral interest ownership is, what their percent of the undivided interest is. So in each of these, it's 25%. And so we're actually reducing that fraction by doing this. So we can go a 0.125 times the 0.25, and that equals a 0.03125. 0.03125. Now, before they owned a 0.125, so they had a 1 in this first decimal place. Now their interest is reduced. Now we have a 0 here. So you can see that they lost interest. So it's going to be the same for every owner. 0.125 times 0.25 is going to be 0.03125. So each of these owners is going to own a 0.03125. Or a 25% interest in the 1/8. So if we took this 0.03125 that we have here and we multiply it by 4, oh, I did that wrong, sorry, 0.03. And we're going to multiply that times 4, or 25% each. And that's not the right answer because we need to, let me try one more time, folks. Bear with me. 0.03125. And what we're doing is we're just multiplying it by 4 times 25% each times 4. And that's going to equal your 1/8, 0.125. Okay, so everybody got it. That is called joint ownership, also known as undivided ownership interest or undivided interest, also called tenants in common, and sometimes it's called co-tenants. Those are all the same thing. What we're talking about is when more than one person owns an interest in the property and they own it together. They own it jointly. That's why it's called joint ownership. So now let's look at problem number 2 with respect to this undivided interest.